Hey, it's Dr. Mitch. Let's go ahead and get into this topic, the opiates. We're going to just try to start as early as possible. I'm going to try not to be too alarmist about it. I know this is an epidemic lately, but let's be rational here. I'm going to get into some of the history, although I don't want to get dragged down by that. The pharmacokinetics, just how does it work? What parts of the body actually metabolize it? Where is it effective? Mechanisms of actions. We'll get into the medical use, acute and chronic effects, pain, and overdose. Generally, when we're going to do an individual drug topic like this, there's going to be some dates for the hallmark drugs, often a name or two, and then understanding acute and chronic effects. And then if there are alternative ways of creating those effects, we'll get into it. The only name really that's important here is Sir Turner, and we'll get to him, but he's behind morphine. And the mechanisms of action, if you understand that there are endorphins, that there's basically that the opiates mimic a whole class of chemicals that are naturally occurring, you'll be in good shape. So opiates, the good and the bad. Well, the most dramatic example of a double-edged sword. We do have sort of heroin as this platonic form of the addictive drug. And so what do we mean by that? Generally, we notice that the time from first use to problematic use is relatively short, that people develop tolerance really rapidly. So a small dose that creates euphoria no longer creates euphoria after repeated administration, and that the withdrawal is really grueling. Now, I got to admit there's a culture around that, and in other cultures, maybe heroin withdrawal is not treated as anything more severe than a bad flu, and that we've kind of grown up hearing like, oh, the withdrawal is so terrible, and that may be contributing. The cross-cultural work hasn't been done with samples that are big enough to really draw those conclusions, but I do think that that's part of it. It is far and away true that the opiates are the most potent painkillers, but there are a lot of ways to handle pain, and we'll get into some of the behavioral ones by the end of these lectures. So where's it all come from? That poppy that I showed on the first day, those red flowers, the Papaver somniferum. All right, Papaver, literally poppy somniferum for sleep, right? Somnambulating, sleepwalking, same root. It is native to the Middle East. It doesn't mean the Middle East is to blame, okay? Like the plant just happened to grow there. We did discover that cutting it and getting the sap to run and then gathering that up was helpful for folks. Pain is a huge problem. When you think about basically how surgery is done today, we could not do it without some pretty serious anesthetics. And at the time, the way surgery was done and things like that, you really weren't going to open up the chest or the abdomen because we just did not have a way to handle that. But particularly we'll see as the Civil War and some of the Prussian wars overseas were going on, we really needed some kind of way to handle pain because people were, basically getting gangrene. People would have a shot to the toe and then have it get gangrenous, and gaseous gangrene was going to spread, so they'd amputate the whole foot, and then people need to deal with that pain like that. That's some serious stuff. So yes, the seed pod and the poppy secrete the opium, basically just that top part, and we'll talk about it later. It's been cultivated for at least 6,000 years. I think 6,400 is certainly a reasonable guess, and used medicinally in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Depending upon who's doing the translating, some of the Homeric works suggest that folks had opiates. Clearly, there were medicinal drugs for pain all the way back then, probably not smoked, more ingested and then dissolved in wine. Whatever wine was back then may not have been necessarily 14% alcohol, but you could put some alcohol in opiates in alcohol, and that was what was laudanum. Later history, again, I'm kind of glossing over this. It says Islam did not prohibit the use of opium specifically. Now, obviously, I don't want to insult modern-day Muslims, and any intoxicant is necessarily problematic, but the take-home message was there weren't prohibitions against this the way there were prohibitions against alcohol, and medicinally opiates were understandably allowed. when I get into the cannabis stuff and I start getting all the angry emails about Allah and stuff, feel free to vent your spleen on me. I don't mind. This is just the way the history looks. So yes, Arab traders through Silk Road and things like that. Basically, you've got a good medicine that helps pain like this, particularly if it is an addictive substance. What a surprise! That's great for sales. So spread to India and China. Gradually, China started to try to control opium use in the early 1700s. And basically, yeah, white people decided, no, you need to buy opium from us so we can have tea. Like the opium wars really occupied big chunks of the 1800s in the United Kingdom and China, going back and forth, trying to basically, United Kingdom saying, no, we need tea, take our opium for it, that we basically stole from India, and China saying, hey, everybody's all strung out on opium, go away, leave us alone. And that is a ridiculous oversimplification of the issue. So by the 1800s, the 19th century, we got a serious problem in China, and opium was usually smoked there. And the thought was, hey, maybe if we've only got oral administration here in the U.S., we're not going to run into problems. It's all about the smoking. Obviously, when we were hiring Chinese folks to come and build our railroads and they wanted to smoke, and rather than come outright with racist notions, we would just say, oh, well, okay, opium dens are illegal. Now, I will be the first to admit, I'm guessing an opium den wasn't necessarily a church, but it did sound like, yeah, there were concerns about prostitution and opium addiction, but to grab something that's a habit of one culture and not another and make it illegal, we'll talk about again when we get into cannabis prohibitions. And then widespread medical use in Europe and the USA. So opium was usually ingested in liquid form by Caucasians, and with fewer problems. Well, okay, so you're not going to have that rapid onset that we saw when you get a smoked drug. So the potential for addiction might be a little bit smaller, but let's be honest here. Particularly before the Harrison Act or the Pure Food and Drug Act, when people had no idea what they were ingesting in Dr. Poppy's wonderful magical elixir, people were taking opium and didn't even know it, and then they would get these terrible headaches and then basically just take another drink, not realizing that this is what opium withdrawal is all about. And so lots and lots of folks consumed liquids that had opiates in them. Once Pure Food and Drug basically made them put it on the label, a lot of folks quit. Now, recreational use in Europe and USA increased problems. I mean, yeah, what a surprise. So if everybody's strung out on opiates, it does make your work day a little less efficient. But the take-home message was we were trying to, first of all, battle some alcohol-related problems as well, and really make sure that we had an opportunity to help folks who were genuinely in pain, but without getting them all strung out on a substance that they were literally going to need every day from then on. Well, technological advances. So basically, you're going to watch the history here, and it's like, oh, we've got some new painkiller, but it's not addictive. And then years later, we realize, whoops, sorry. Yeah, it is. So Sir Turner, again, he's isolating morphine early 1800s. If you know that, you'll be glad you did. What's morphine? Well, who's Morpheus? Other than Lawrence Fishburne in The Matrix, Morpheus was the Greek god of dreams. Basically, it was like, here, this is going to help enhance sleep and creates this kind of dreamy, subjective state. But more importantly, this was close enough to the invention of the hypodermic needle in the 1850s that this was going to be a big plus in the Civil War in the U.S. when people were, essentially, even though a lot of it was musket and ball, getting shot and not really having any way to deal with it. And it wasn't so much that the injuries were severe as the infections that follow, sepsis and things like that. So they'd end up doing a lot of amputations, and this was, a godsend under those circumstances. So treatment of pain from wounds was definitely improved. I mean, truth be told, other than that, we had bite on the stick while I cut the bullet out. I mean, it really was not a time when we had any of the inhalants for pain or much else. Willow bark, right? But wounded soldiers became addicted to morphine, and it ended up being the soldier's disease. So certainly in the 1870s, there were guys walking around. Oh, we don't need to get into my family of origin, but who had basically walked with a cane or a crutch, who were strung out on morphine from Civil War related problems. And yeah, we a lot of people died in the U.S. in the Civil War because they were all Americans. All right. 1874, Wright invents diacetylmorphine. So basically, we got morphine. We're going to add these two acetyl groups. What's really going on here? Well, the Bayer Company, literally the ones who make the aspirin, said, hey, this is really a stellar painkiller and it's great for coughs. So yes, all the opiates suppress the part of your brain that makes you cough, but they were literally marking it by 1898 as, hey, it's our heroic new painkiller cough suppressant and it's non-addictive. And so they called it heroin. Now, the fact that we were this naive does say something about, okay, there was no FDA yet. We didn't have tons and tons of follow-up data and things like that. But it really was marketed as a cough suppressant and a pain reliever. And I mean, I had a friend who was on codeine because she was pregnant and had a broken rib, and every time she coughed, she hurt herself, and she'd do a little bit of that, and her kids are fine. But again, we're talking about a high risk for dependent substance because tolerance develops so rapidly, and because the withdrawal is so notoriously bad, at least that's the word. Well, so what's up with the 20th century? We talked about this just briefly when we were doing the over-the-counter meds. Oh, you guys haven't heard that lecture yet. Sorry. But the Harrison Narcotics Act passed, and it's basically going to restrict opiates to medical use. All right. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was before that, but just said, hey, let everybody know what the hell they're drinking when you pick up this bottle. And a lot of folks quit then. By 1914, what we're seeing is a gradual winding up for what, first of all, qualifies as a medical use. So if you're at all connected to medical use, first off, they could say, okay, well, I need medical use for opiate addiction. Gradually, as the laws changed, you can see by 1924, there were no prescriptions for heroin, no prescriptions for addicts in 1917. And don't drive yourself nuts with these dates, but just understand that what we did was basically yank the rug out from under opiate addicts until essentially it was either quit or go to the underground market. And I try to stay away from this black market expression. I apologize for that on the slide, but basically, folks who were maybe drinking laudanum or something like that, had that taken away, end up unable to get an opiate prescribed. What are they going to do? They're going to end up either smoking opium. The pipers of the 20s were basically opium smokers. That's why they called them pipers. And it wasn't necessarily how they wanted to do it, but you can imagine the state of addictions treatment at the time was literally like go to church and weep. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity to make any changes to that. Well, so with that in mind, this change in the demographics. Before 1914, opiates were used by all classes and across the country. Literally, I mean, how many big cities were there in the U.S. at the time? But this was when those mail order tinctures and beverages were available. After 1914, more concentration in the cities. Now, remember, there's more people in the cities too, so we don't want to make too much of that, but the base rate per population was increased. Heroin becomes the preferred opiate when opium far and away was the preferred one beforehand. So of course organized crime is involved. Once you create this underground market, there's money to be made. Users were poor, younger, poorly educated men. I think in some ways the women were underestimated if they could still use the tinctures and the various beverages. And it's not like, hey, rich people can give it up easier than poor people. It's just they had more resources to work around it or else to get it in above ground ways, basically to make a physician's payment so that they could say, I say that I've got this chronic pain, or say that I've got this disorder where I need it. So with that in mind, where are the current suppliers? Now, obviously, I can't keep up with this because it's like a giant balloon. So as soon as law enforcement squeezes on one spot, another spot just amps up their production. But what we're going to understand, that golden triangle, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand. And again, I'm not blaming these people. This is how they make a living. You've got a bunch of land and you've got to grow something and want to make as much money off it as possible. And you're not going to farm cucumbers, right? So basically the Asian countries there, we got Afghanistan and Pakistan. When they're war torn, obviously there's no sense in planting plants if you don't even know you're going to live there the next week. But then things then move to South and Central America, depending upon basically the price of cocoa versus opiates, and they're going to grow. These are all places that are warm and, you know, have a lot of sunlight, and obviously that's a big plus. But yeah, what else are they supposed to do? So with that in mind, we're noticing changes in quality control over the years. So street heroin is cut or adulterated, although over, say, the last 50 years, concentrations have increased pretty dramatically. That market has gotten more competitive. With that in mind, though, then, in the underground market, you have no idea what the concentration is of the drug you purchase. So the chance of overdose is higher simply because you just don't know how much is in a bag. Because processing quality varies, we do see these folks who inadvertently overdose simply because they're accustomed to doing, you know, one bag at a time, and then suddenly they get a bag that's really pure. The other thing is there's a lot of conditioned tolerance in this. So if you usually do it, you know, in your own room in the dark with the TV on, and then suddenly you're dope sick and have to go do it in some fluorescent lighted bathroom in some bar somewhere, you don't have the same cues, so your body doesn't get to do the classically conditioned tolerance moves and literally end up, you know, dying in some foreign location, in part because you just don't have that conditioned tolerance kicking in. I know this is not a pleasant subject, and I certainly apologize, but it's just the truth of the situation. So because of this variation in quality, we see a lot more deaths by overdose, particularly in novel environments, than we do in folks who are regular users who have, you know, a source where they know what the quality, or at least the purity, is. So with that in mind, what are some of the health consequences? Obviously, we got a risk associated with any IV drug use. Now, not in the United States, of course, but there have been places where I've been trying to just ask folks at the needle exchange to hand out rolls of aluminum foil. Now, that sounds stupid, I realize, but what's going to happen? Moving to smoked, inhaled heroin, particularly given the purity that's available on the street in some places, is, in a sense, a harm reduction technique, right? You're much less likely to get AIDS if you're smoking it than if you're injecting it. The shared needle thing is just a terrible idea. I mean, talk about astounding way to get an infectious disease. So at least through 2010 or so, nearly a quarter of IV drug users were infected with HIV. And I do want to emphasize that, you know, just, it's not that HIV is the same in every person. Like literally the virus mutates, saying, oh, well, we're both HIV positive, so we might as well share needles, is you get another mutated form of HIV. It is hugely bad for you. Now people say, well, you know, they're already banging heroin. They obviously don't care about their lives. Trust me, they want to live. Like they still want to have pleasure. They would love to, you know, have a normal life, and having to score heroin 4 times a day is quite the interrupter. But keeping it on the underground may not be necessarily the most adaptive way to deal with that. Their sexual partners and children may also become infected with HIV. So mother to offspring transmission is sad and unfortunately rather common. The trading sex for drugs market too. This is really a tough predicament that these folks are in. IV drug users engage in risky sex and share needles. Again, it's not like that's their first choice. It's that the availability of needles is odd, shall we say. Really tough to get your hands on clean needles in some cities in particular. And the fact that, we can have needles for people to shoot insulin, but we can't have people shooting heroin. Okay. Nevertheless, I think being alive first and then not having HIV would be a plus, and then finally moving towards other kinds of opiate use in order to have a treatment option would be a great idea. All right, I'm going to call it for Opiates 1 here. Go ahead and take yourself a 5-minute break and write yourself some notes, even a few questions to answer, and we'll be in business for Opiates Lecture 2.